After 11 years of this war, with Russia having every advantage, they still only control about 18% of Ukraine. And it's not getting any better. They do not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war. They don't have any massive breakthrough capabilities or some force that could exploit any penetration along the front lines. In fact, what we're seeing in the Russians is just continuation of what the Ukrainians refer to as meat assaults, people on mopeds and motorcycles and e-scooters and golf carts, and they're getting slaughtered. I mean, they lost, according to British intelligence, almost 400,000 casualties last year for a gain of almost zero.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau, and we are joined today by senior retired American General, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Ben was Commander US Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. He's also commanded in Iraq and Afghanistan and is a regular guest here on Frontline. General Ben, great to see you again. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Now, we're speaking as negotiations are due just to be getting underway between Ukrainian and Russian counterparts in Istanbul. There will be no Zelensky-Putin head-to-head, and Donald Trump has said nothing will happen until he meets Putin. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has also said he doesn't have high expectations. So are these talks actually dead in the water before they even start?
Well, I think what we've seen is of these three leaders, only Volodymyr Zelensky seems to be a man of real character, and that can be trusted to do what he says. President Trump, I think, has waffled so much back and forth, and because his style of leadership and the way he governs is purely transactional, I don't think he actually cares about Ukraine, only about getting a deal of some sort, regardless of what the impact might be on Ukrainians. Vladimir Putin, I never believed that he was going to show up in Istanbul. And he also has no interest in ending this conflict. He's going to keep doing this as long as he thinks that we in the West will quit and abandon Ukraine. So we are still in this, what I would call the preparation phase, which is all the different conversations going on in all the different places at different levels, trying to get to phase two, which is a ceasefire. That's what this is all about, trying to agree on a ceasefire and what would be necessary to compel the Russians to live up to that ceasefire. And then you can get to the third phase, which are actual negotiations about sovereignty, about borders, about sanctions, etc.
It's interesting that you say that President Putin was never going to turn up, and yet he was the one that suggested the meeting. He would never turn up anyway because the timeline was not possible for him to do it securely for himself to travel to Turkey anyway, was it? I mean, was he completely wrong-footed when President Zelensky said, yes, I'll come?
Well, certainly he is I think, was surprised when Zelensky goes, okay, I'll do it, but you got to be there. I'm not talking to your deputy dog. And so probably he was a little surprised that Zelensky called his bluff, and President Trump being so unpredictable. I think there really was probably some uncertainty about who's going to do what. That's why I say that Zelensky is the only man of character in this mix.
While these talks are going on, if they do go on today, and we await the outcome of all of these negotiations, important to remember that the first ceasefire was now proposed on the 11th of March. We're weeks away from that. And what is the importance, while all of this is carrying on, that Ukrainian forces holding the front line, have been seen to hold it in Ukraine, continue to do so?
Well, this is the part that I think is underreported, and I'm glad I'm glad that you have highlighted this. That after 11 years of this war, with Russia having every advantage, they still only control about 18% of Ukraine, and it's not getting any better. They do not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war. They don't have any massive breakthrough capabilities or some force that could exploit any penetration along the front lines. In fact, what we're seeing in the Russians is just continuation of these what the Ukrainians refer to as meat assaults. People on mopeds and motorcycles and e-scooters and golf carts, and they're getting slaughtered. I mean, they lost, according to British intelligence, almost 400,000 casualties last year for a gain of almost zero. So this is incredible, and I think it goes in large part to Ukraine's ability to rapidly integrate different types of drones into what they're doing. Um, and I think they have obviously grown and matured a lot as a fighting force over the last 3 years. And it helps that Russia still does not know how to conduct combined arms operations where they can integrate air, land, forces, drones, all the different things to launch an effective assault.
The Russians have also been very effective in ramping up their drone production as well, haven't they? And there is a saturation of first-person view drones and fiber optic drones along the front lines. What kind of impact has that had, and difficulties has that presented to Ukrainian infantry troops who are manning those front lines and their ability to supply them?
Well, you are correct that the Russians have also gotten very good at this, and they've always been very good at electronic warfare as well. So you've got a situation where on both sides, you know, out to 20 kilometers or so, it's very difficult for any vehicle to move because of the saturation of these tactical type drones. It's difficult to conceal yourself or to protect yourself. They're getting better, but it's still very difficult. And one of the ways this has showed up is in logistics. It's very difficult to move stuff, ammunition, and so on, up to where it's needed, but it also is very difficult to get casualties out. And so you've probably got a lot more soldiers potentially dying of wounds than would have otherwise. But this is part of the character of this battlefield.
How stretched do you think the infantry troops are, though, along those front lines?
Well, if you mean in terms of density or numbers, the all I can say is that the Russians have not been able to break through. I mean, anywhere. You remember February last year when Avdiivka was finally captured, you know, and I was at the Munich Security Conference, and people were talking about, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen. You look on the map, Avdiivka is almost in Russia. I mean, it's as far east as you can go. And here we are, February, March, April, May, 15 months later, they still haven't captured Pokrovsk, which is about 60 kilometers from Avdiivka. So they just don't have the ability to create a significant penetration and then exploit it with any kind of follow-on forces. Now, if you're talking about how stretched are they mentally or physically, I've got to think they're exhausted. But I don't have a good enough feel for how the Ukrainians are rotating people in and out of the trenches or out of the lines there, but they seem to be managing very well, all things considered.
And if, as people are saying, Putin's intention for his soldiers is for them to simply dig in, carry on, and outstay Ukraine on the battlefield, how does Ukraine need to be supported by its allies?
Well, I think there's at least three things that all the allies and supporters of Ukraine should be doing. Number one, there's a psychological strategic messaging aspect to it, which is to say, we are committed. We want Ukraine to win. We're going to help Ukraine with everything they need in order to, if not defeat Russia, which is what I had always expected and thought would happen, but at least make sure that there's no way that Russia accomplishes their objective. That's number one. That needs to be loud and clear from all the governments supporting Ukraine. And then in practical terms, of course, air and missile defense. This is the one thing that there is no amount of Ukrainian courage and bravery that can supplement or fill in the gap of air and missile defense. Even though the battlefield is clearly in favor of the Ukrainians, Russians are still killing civilians almost every night in different towns and cities across Ukraine with these drone strikes and missile launches. So air and missile defense has got to be a part of that. And then thirdly, Ukrainians have gotten very good at their own defense industry. I mean, they've grown it while at war, but they're not yet able to scale it to the quantities of what they need. So this is where I think Western countries could, businesses could invest in Ukraine. There's German companies and British company that are already doing this, as are some others. This is an area where I think nations could do a lot to support Ukraine.
And you're speaking to us from Germany, which is where you live. How close do you think Germany is in supplying those long desired Taurus missiles, and how much of a difference could they make if and when they do?
Well, we certainly are closer now than we were during the previous German government. Under Schultz, it was never going to happen. And before he was named as Bundeskanzler, Friedrich Merz said absolutely they would provide Taurus. Of course, now he's in government, and I don't think this is something he can just unilaterally do. It doesn't seem so. I think they're doing the work inside the government. It's a coalition government, of course, and I I would like to tell you, of course, it's going to happen in the next weeks, but it's too hard to know what all the different forces are that are preventing him from doing it immediately. But I do believe that Friedrich Merz wants to do that. He's not. This is not a an ideological issue for him anymore.
Mm. If we can just return to the events and the warnings from last weekend, from that meeting of European plus US allies, well, on the phone, Donald Trump and Ukraine, this should have been the moment when they joined forces to impose punitive sanctions on the Kremlin for not entering into that immediate ceasefire that they called for on Monday. Do you think we are getting any closer to US President Donald Trump getting tough on Putin?
I think this was a missed opportunity last week. I was so fired up when I saw the four leaders there: the your prime minister, the Polish prime minister, the German Bundeskanzler, and the French president, all there with President Zelensky. And it felt like, all right, these guys are recognizing that they have got to do something with or without the U.S. And then it just kind of fizzled because they either weren't committed or they felt like Trump pulled the rug out from under them or whatever. So I'm not going to let them get away with saying, well, we were going to, but Trump or whatever. So I don't know why they didn't follow through. I mean, Merz was pretty solid. He said, if not by midnight, then we're going to put in sanctions. And so I think we were all waiting on Tuesday to hear about it. And instead, what it sounds like is the 17th sanctions package from the EU is in fact going to be approved here at some point, but that doesn't have quite the same effect. And also just think about it, when you hear 17 sanctions packages, why didn't these all happen at why isn't there just one? I mean, and this is a reflection of us not being committed to helping Ukraine to actually be successful. Now, I have zero confidence in my own president that he actually wants to do anything that will punish Vladimir Putin. I've seen zero evidence of that. He's threatened like 4 times to do something and absolutely does zero. And Putin shows his disrespect by launching missile strikes into Ukraine. So the Russians are not impressed or in awe of the American president, not this American president. And we've lost so much credibility, unfortunately. And the president actually has huge amounts of leverage he could be using. I mean, obviously, he could open up the floodgates on ammunition and weapons and et cetera without restriction. The second bit of leverage he has, of course, is the damage he could do to Russia's oil and gas industry, either by working with European nations to disrupt the flow on these so-called shadow vessels that are taking oil and gas out through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. I mean, we could do a lot more to disrupt that flow. Or he could work with his new friends in the Middle East and as well as UK and Norway to affect the price of gas in the global markets. that would make it very difficult for Russia to continue. So he has leverage. He just has not chosen to use it.
And how optimistic are you that this American bill by Senator Lindsey Graham for huge sanctions and tariffs against Russia, which seems to be gaining support, will be passed regardless of whether Trump wants to veto it?
Well, I heard that there were 70 senators that had signed up for it right now. Um, that would be enough to override a veto if it came down to it. But that's before senators start getting pressure from the White House. So I'd like to say I'm optimistic about it, but I don't have enough. I mean, the White House seems to be completely in the pocket of the Kremlin. Everything they do and say indicates that they are taking the side of the Kremlin, and I can't understand it.
It's interesting. This is the first time I've actually spoken to you, Ben, since U.S. President was Donald Trump became the U.S. president. I'm just wondering how you have experienced the last few months as a person who is a staunch supporter of Ukraine, and we've talked many times about how Ukraine should be supported for victory in this awful war that's now more than 3 years long.
The White House, the Trump approach was doomed to failure from the start because he never understood or cared about the cause of the war or who the bad guy was or the history involved, the geography involved. He has no sense, and the people around him also, at least they act as if they also have no sense of the geography of the Black Sea and why this whole thing matters for America and for our allies. When he was that terrible day when he had Zelensky in the Oval Office and was talking about, you got no cards. I thought, what? I mean, first of all, how embarrassing that the president in the Oval Office is yelling at the president of another democratic country who's fighting for his life, and to say you got no cards shows that the president and his team have zero understanding of the nature of war, why people fight. I mean, you could say the Taliban had no cards, but they defeated us. You could say the Viet Cong had no cards, but they defeated us. And so that day was very revealing because that's what told me that they had no interest actually in helping Ukraine win. They just want to get a deal. And so they're not even organized for success. You've got this Mr. Witkoff, who I'm sure is a terrific real estate salesman, but he's absolutely incompetent as an envoy, at least in dealing with the Russians. You got Secretary Rubio, who when he was a senator was a tiger, but now he is a pussycat. I mean, he looks to be one of the most unhappy people in that cabinet there, and he's not the same defender of transatlantic relationship and NATO that I remember when he was Senator Rubio. And then General Kellogg, who's the third part of this sort of team, who was a very good, honorable general officer, but he is, I would say, he's been declawed, and they don't seem to have a good structure and a way ahead. And of course, if you're driven by transactional motives instead of principles, then it's you're not likely to have a winning strategy to achieve a conflict resolution.
And where does all of this actually leave the European allies of Ukraine? Because you were recently at the St. Gallen Symposium in Switzerland, and there you spoke about European security and the need for Europe to have more self confidence. What is lacking?
Europeans are going to have to understand and accept that if the United States continues on the path we're on right now, um, and may not be an active, I hope I'm wrong on this, by the way, but may not be an active part of the defense of Europe, including our own interests in Europe, and will be willing to look away from what Russia is doing, then the threat only goes up for Europe. If there's no U.S., then Putin only becomes more emboldened. So Europe will have to address this one way or the other. And if you think about the um, combined economies and defense industries of all the nations of Europe, including UK and also including Canada, it dwarfs Russia. I mean, it's not even close. The wealth, the industry, the economies, um, and so I think what is missing is political will and self confidence to act, to work together. There, people are so accustomed to being bullied around by the Russians and expecting the Americans to protect them. That those days may be over, and so that doesn't make the threat
Do
go
you think
away.
also, though, there is a problem when you talk about the threat? There is a lack of consensus between the different European countries on the threat that it does pose, and that is actually influenced by the geography and how close they are to the border with Russia.
I think certainly that's a part of it. Um, but I've been impressed with Prime Minister Starmer here in the last few months. He has been forward leaning despite all the challenges he has to deal with. The French, President Macron is increasingly forceful and clear in his position. So it's not just our allies from Finland down to Romania that are and Poland that are looking at this. There are other countries that are paying attention, but they got to act, and they need to explain to their parliaments and assemblies what's at stake and why you have to deal with this. Otherwise, this is never going to end. What we're seeing now will be continue to be the norm unless we act.
And we've seen an expansion of Russia's troop presence along stretches of its border with the West and a ramping up of military spending, the intensifying of covert operations. Do you think Russia is quietly preparing for a wider conflict with the West, or are we already there?
So I would say that's a great question. I would say we're already there. You know, we're focusing on what they're doing in Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of troops, and you always hear, oh, they're getting ready for another offensive. All that means is they're just another wave of draftees that are going to be fed into that meat grinder. But at the same time, they are conducting all sorts of different types of warfare in the Baltic Sea, for example. I mean, yesterday you had Russian aircraft violating Estonian airspace as the Estonians were attempting to stop one of these illegal shadow vessels. They were preparing to board it, and then the Russian Air Force came in there and intervened. Um, so um, Yeah, and this is the norm now. The destruction of underwater pipelines and communications cables. Um, the French announcing all the spying and things that they have uncovered. Attempts to deliver bombs to UK and other places on DHL aircraft. I mean, this is nonstop, and the Russians are at war with us, and they're pushing it in so many different ways. And at some point, we are going to have to acknowledge this and take steps. Otherwise, it will just continue and continue until something really bad happens.
And it's a week since Putin's Victory Day parade to mark the 80th anniversary of the defeat of the Nazis. And he did want to show strength, both ceremonially and on the battlefield. How successful do you think he is in manipulating the West's perception of his strength and his capabilities?
Well, I think that he certainly has had some success. I watched that Victory Day parade and tried to think through what are the implications of what we saw. And the biggest thing that I took away was the fact that President Xi was there for 4 days. And this was probably Xi um, making it clear to the world that he still has Russia in his orbit and that the Chinese are not going to just stand by. They've tried to sort of mask what they're doing, but I think that for the Chinese, they don't want any disruption of their access to cheap Russian oil and gas. Increasingly, they want to be able to use the northern trade route, which runs along the Arctic, Russia's Arctic border. Um, and I think they're content to see all of us having challenges, so supporting Ukraine. So the fact that Xi was there, and with to include with troops, that I think that was the most meaningful thing I saw. Otherwise, I looked at thousands of troops out there marching. Most of them will be dead by the end of this year, if they get sent to the fight. And you know they don't have hundreds of tanks to roll in the parades anymore because they've all been destroyed. So parades can be revealing in a number of ways.
Mm. And just to return to the current situation and the talks which may or may not be getting underway today in Turkey, you've recently counselled against President Zelensky ever accepting a deal that is bad for Ukraine. We seem a long way off that any deal that would be acceptable will be presented to him. So what? That the war continues, one side ends up stronger, or both run out of resources? How do you see this actually developing?
Well, I pay attention to what Ukrainians say, and I don't get the feeling. I would not be an expert on this. I acknowledge, but I don't get the feeling that there's a big push inside Ukraine to please, we'll take whatever, just stop the fighting. You don't get that feeling from any Ukrainians, and they know that there will not be a normal surrender to Russia where okay, it's over, everybody go back and we can resume normal life now. It would be more than just losing territory. It would be total dominance. And it would also mean millions of Ukrainians would feel they had no choice but to migrate, to leave Ukraine and head west into Central and Western Europe because they know what happens when the Red Army is there. And so I think that they will continue doing this as long as it's necessary and as long as they believe they have the ability to fight. Um, I think there's a lot that we don't know that is being done, that capabilities that Ukraine has, and at some point, some European countries, even if the United States fails, some European countries and Canada are going to have to commit to helping Ukraine because this is not about charity for Ukraine. This affects all of us.
And how long do you think the war will continue where you're standing and looking at it today?
As I can't put a number on it because the one thing that determines how long it goes on is Vladimir Putin inside his head. Um, it won't be casualties that causes him to stop. It'll be when he realizes there's no way he's ever going to win.
Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. If you'd like to know more about the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe and sign up for a membership. You can also get more analysis by listening to Times Radio or read thetimes.com. But for now, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.